Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. And I'm I'm trying to position
Trying to
myself,
be on the right
as you
side
can
of
see,
history.
trying to be on the right side of history or something. And this is Friends and Enemies. I'm Jeff Nyquist. I'm in the U.S. Alex Benesch is there at the desk, and he's in Germany. And we're here to discuss some current events. And of course, we're going to look in on some subjects we've touched on before, UFOs, and this new book by Richard Poe, How the British Invented Communism, what we think of the book. And why don't you begin? You think we should start with the UFO thing just to get
Sure.
people's hair stand up in the back of their necks?
Sure. I have a variety of very current, interesting notes here. Now, of course, in Russia, when you create a stir, when you create a wave of activism and indignation, right, in Russia, demanding that the government divulge its secrets concerning the Air Force and, Space Force that they have and all that sort of stuff, you get a very unpleasant visit from government people. Now, this is just like they would visit you in any other way if you speak out against the war, if you speak out against anything that's going on in Russia. So, yeah, not happening in Russia, though. They do have UFO alien ancient pyramid activism in Russia, too, obviously. We've done a whole show on the occultism in Russia, how they use it abroad, and all the shamanism. So people can check out that episode for a very interesting background. So, but you can't do that type of activism over there that you can do here, right? So over here, you can talk about all kinds of subjects, things that the military has seen, stuff that the average Air Force personnel cannot really explain. And you can mix in anything that you could think of, right? From ancient pyramids to green aliens and gray aliens and whatnot. And then you create the stir. Anything will do, anything will serve that purpose of creating public pressure and then political pressure to unravel the secrets of the United States government. And, we've mentioned Tucker Carlson before in this regard. And obviously Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, incredibly successful podcaster, and he's sort of turned into a George Noory type character, right? I mean, he's got a lot of guests on, especially recently, talking about ancient aliens and the pyramids and some extremely weird stuff, right? So recently he had a guest on, very controversial one, Billy Carson, talking about the pyramids and they, meaning whatever dark force, they're keeping this truth away from us. And once we find the truth with people like Billy Carson and Joe Rogan, once we have it, we can be free and happy and live happily ever after. And then there was another appearance on Rogan. This was actor Terrence Howard. And he was claiming to have godlike abilities. He found a new system of logic, he said, and a new system of mathematics. And then he presented a bunch of gibberish for hours that made no sense. And many popular scientists who are on the web, Neil deGrasse Tyson and others, they have a lot of followers on the web. They commented on this because I think scientists, legitimate scientists, are getting a bit scared because some of this activism is quite maybe dangerous, right? So when people talk about the angry talk to these angry followers and they tell them they are keeping this stuff away from you, alien technology, magic and whatnot, they keep you down, they keep you unhappy. We need some sort of a revolutionary type movement to unravel those secrets. And obviously the actor Terrence Howard on the Rogan program, he failed at baseline math, baseline chemistry, and physics. Okay. And even scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson was called out in this on the show. So for not liking Terrence Howard's paper from years ago. And there was kind of an aggression, with Howard. He was saying that, well, maybe he was insinuating that Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of them keeping this away from us. Just creating this anger. And I think that legitimate scientists know that dumb people, angry people, they want to get into positions of power, and then they will come for the smart people, because that's usually how that goes. Same with communism, obviously. When the Russians, they of course did that to themselves. They never took responsibility for it. They said that, outside forces, them, they brought forced communism onto Russia, but in reality, these angry peasants over in Russia, they chose to sign contracts with the Red Army and kill other Russians. So we see where this is going, and we see how many smart people in Russia were killed after the revolution. So this is something that I noticed recently, so that's why I have it in my notes. Incredibly large podcasts, incredibly large shows, people talking about this, and then in the next stage, we see political figures in America introducing bills and creating this sort of pressure to unravel the secrets. Because if we don't get the secrets, they enjoy them, and we are the downtrodden masses.
Well, maybe you didn't hear this. It hasn't reached Europe, but yesterday, Logan Paul had a sit down with Trump.
Yeah, I have that in my notes.
He asked him about UFOs, and Trump said, curiously, he said, well, I talked about pilots who had described things, but Trump called himself, I'm not a believer. I don't believe in them.
Very measured response.
So,
this was
So if Trump has got some kind of UFO secrets, if he's the president and he's been told something, he's saying he doesn't believe, right?
Yeah.
So
and other presidents have talked about this. Obama has been asked about this, and he gave a very sly, suave answer, and Clinton has talked about this.
Yeah, it's like there's no there, right?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing for them to tell. They don't know anything.
Yeah.
And see, this is the thing, and this is where you start to scratch below the surface. And of course, people like Ross Coulthart would say, well, it's being kept from the presidents. It's some secret group of defense contractors that are holding on to the truth here. But I think rather, there was an interesting series done by, I think it was the New York Post had a reporter who was doing a series on the Skinwalker Ranch and about the Pentagon's UAP program that was using money to investigate it. And of course, the thing is, these guys were kind of like half-baked into the paranormal, and when the Pentagon found out what they were looking into and what the poor quality of their research was, they pulled the plug on them. And these guys, apparently, according to the research by the New York Post, they were misrepresenting their credentials and how much real science they were doing. And so it's and of course, whenever you get into the paranormal, it becomes, I've known parapsychologists. I know that they've done there's cutting edge things that have been done, but it's not, they're not able to prove the existence of UFO aliens. Yeah. That's not it.
And
that's
science
a different
is hard.
subject, right?
Science is really hard, and
very
you have to cover all your bases before you start going outside of the box, and maybe you start expanding the boundaries of what we can tell. And this became painfully obvious with these recent guests on Joe Rogan. I mean, Rogan is now the mainstream because the audience size, and it's supposed to be entertaining. The audience, they listen to these guests and they go, whoa, that sounds, cool, I guess. But this is like when you have zero scientific background, when you didn't care about it in school, it's science sounds to you like gibberish. And so then comes a guest on and he talks a bunch of gibberish, and it seems to people, well, you could be true, right? But the difference is, besides, science versus not science, the other difference is, science, there's an underlying optimism in science. We can fix problems. We have tangible results in science. We can do all kinds of cool stuff. And we may be ultimately able to fix even larger problems. But when you listen to some of these ancient aliens, UFO alien guys, there's sort of this underlying salvation mythology that they sell. You're the downtrodden masses, and once we uncover the secrets, it's an explosion of awesome, and we can fly around and we can have
Right.
godlike abilities. And so this is kind of that thing that I saw in
It's
communism, right? When the
yeah.
communists said
Well,
that we're going to create utopia.
yeah. It's Eric Verglen would call it a Gnostic speculation, right? So the Gnostics believed that man could kind of become God if he had the knowledge, and the God that created the universe is kind of a devil. He's a demiurgos, right?
Yeah, he
He's
doesn't
a
want us to have the cool stuff.
right. He's got it. We're trapped here. We're imprisoned in the creation of the demiurgos, and our whole goal is to escape. It's like we're in Alcatraz, and we got to figure a way out. And of course, it's knowledge that is our way out. If we have the right knowledge, we're going to escape. Not that creation is a good thing, that we're here doing something important. It's that no, this is all bad. We have to leave. We have to leave the game of reality. And of course, I'm not a materialist, but communism is a materialistic version of that. We're going to leave the game by having a revolution and overthrowing the existing system, and thus there is within communism a kind of you could call it an the evil capitalists and the system is against everybody. So we're all trapped in the system, and we've got to overthrow it. So it's again a Gnostic speculation, and Verglen uses this the model of the Gnostic. Well, the ancient alien stuff is Gnostic speculation, because if only we knew the truth about who we really were, and that we really knew our past, and somebody has taken our history away and the knowledge of who we are, and we're trapped somehow, right? And it's maybe there's bad aliens keeping us down. Who knows what the speculation is? You've got they like to quote Charles Hoy Fort, who wrote the Book of the Damned, in which he said perhaps we are owned by something. We're the property of an extraterrestrial civilization, or he called it a extraterrestrial Genghis Khan or Tamerlane the Great.
And some people want to be controlled, even if they don't fully realize it or admit it. Some people, they want to be run. They want to follow this all-powerful leader. And we talked about this in previous shows, that specific angle when, leaders of the past, especially the ancient world, they would be crazy oftentimes, and they would try psychedelic drugs, and they would tell people they are gods and they have special powers. And if you worship them, good things happen. But if bad things happen, then it's somebody else's fault for, reasons.
And by the way, this use of psychedelics or use of mind-altering drugs to attain communication with the gods, and we mentioned this before. There's a new guy out. He's a student of ancient Greek. He's some kind of philologist out of Wisconsin, who got kicked out of a Catholic school for being demon possessed.
Okay.
A Catholic college, and he
go.
is claiming that the ancient religions, ancient pagan oracles were based on using certain drugs, using snake venoms as drugs to reach the gods, right? So the Pythian oracle of Apollo, he might be onto something there. But of course, when you listen to him, he's rather out there. But this idea of using these things, and of course, I think we've mentioned before that people who have certain drug experiences seem to see the same kind of entities that UFO abductees claim to see.
Yeah,
which is rather curious,
So
and of course, is it a hallucination? Is it a kind of drug experience? We don't know what it is. But
and when people watch this Terrence Howard guy, an actor, Hollywood actor, right? He was in superhero movies that I haven't seen. When he was rambling on and he was mixing in everything he could possibly think of. So he was talking about elements of the, elements have colors and sounds, and this thing wraps around the other, and it's very artistic, and he creates this art, in private, and he tries to have it patented because he thinks he found the key to the universe. People commented on this on YouTube, and also when scientists, made videos about it, people commented on it, and they said, "Well, I know somebody, a brother or some close friend, people said, I know somebody who sounds exactly like this, talks exactly like this, and this person was diagnosed as a schizophrenic or with some additional conditions." So people always have to be aware of, that even legitimate scientists have produced false things. There's the scientists in history like Nikola Tesla. He's done some great work, and he's done some weird stuff that turned out not to be scientific. So you got that, and then of course you get crazy people who mimic the language of science, or who try to appear knowledge and very authoritative about these subjects. You get all kinds of people, and science is hard. And once you talk about the intelligence world, the science of secrets, this is when a staggering number of people fail. Because when you talk about the intelligence world, this is a field where you don't have the regular toolbox. So you can have a laboratory experiment that you can replicate to prove something, and you don't have easy numbers that you can put into a computer to calculate, right? So other people can replicate this.
Right. Right.
It's
But on the serious side, and this is where, if people want to, someone who's really serious about this and is proceeding, he may have, he always maintains his skepticism, but he's very much believes there's something going on, and I think he's right. There is something going on. What it is not clear. But he gave he gave the keynote speech at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. They had a conference recently, and I saw the speech, and it was really good, and it was intriguing, and he basically condensed in that speech all the evidence that he had found in his 5-6 years of researching the subject when he decided to go in. And he emphasized the need for scientific rigor, for skepticism, for he's got a lot of people in the intelligence community telling him that there are these crash retrieval programs. Now the question is, but the thing is that how many of these people have actually seen anything that's real?
Yeah.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, crash retrieval. We have crash retrieval for Russian and Chinese vehicles that stray into our territory and crash. We try to retrieve just like the Chinese. Just like when one of our advanced fighter aircraft fall off the end of a carrier, we're worried the Chinese are going to get to the ocean floor and recover the technology before we can protect it, right? So, but Coulthard is, he did the David Grush interview. He found this 92-year-old naval engineer, physics expert who was 92 years old, dying of cancer, told him he had seen part of a bulkhead from a crash under Wright-Patterson Field. He'd said that he never saw an alien, but he was told that there were some kind of creatures and there were things that were recovered. I mean, that is intriguing if true. But what's funny is, after all this time, nobody's produced an alien. Nobody's produced these artifacts. And you would think that, but what's interesting is that if you wanted to fabricate something and create the idea that you have advanced technology, maybe that you don't have. And what I really find interesting is the timing of all this. The timing of all this is when we're getting close to a world war.
Yeah.
And we want to scare or maybe bluff the Chinese and Russians. And in my interview with Mr. Wang of Luda Media, my more recent one, the subject of UFOs indirectly came up when he said the Chinese leaders believe we have some kind of advanced technology from crashes, and that they're scared. They don't want to do a war against us until they figure out whether we really have something or not. Now, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and people
Isn't
have
that
debated
interesting
this.
that our intelligence might have gotten them to believe that we have some advanced weapon that they don't dare move on us, maybe when we're not ready at all.
Yeah, and it has been debated what the threshold is. When you look at a piece of supposed potential debris, you look at some kind of artifact, or you look at some kind of organic remains. Okay, so at what
there's
point?
People that have looked at these things, by the way. These things have been analyzed. There's been things, coming off of UFOs that they've analyzed. And what's
Yeah.
interesting is more recently Jacques Vallée got involved because of his connections to have he famously there was a piece of something that crashed off of Brazil, Ubatuba, Brazil. I think it was in the late 1950s, and he got a piece of that thing that Brazilians had recovered, and they analyzed it, and it's like magnesium and some other alloy that
Right.
normally aren't put together, but there was but it was it didn't have to be manufactured somewhere else. And then you had Vallée more recently, this Trinity case. There were these two Mexican American kids that had gotten supposedly this thing had crashed on one of the kids' ranch, and they're in their 80s, and they have this thing under a floorboards. They when the U.S. Army came to haul this thing away, whatever it was, they pulled a panel off the inside of it and put it under the floorboards of an outbuilding. And they pulled it out, and of course, Vallée tested it in its ordinary.
Right.
It was this panel was ordinary aluminum made according to the metric system, right?
The
It
metric
was
system.
aluminum, and some of there was it was normal. They couldn't identify exactly where it was
Mhm.
manufactured, but it was made on the metric system. So wait a minute, that sounds like it was made in Europe,
Yeah,
whatever it
and some
was,
people,
right?
appearing on the Rogan podcast and whatnot, some people will say that well-known pyramids are evidence of magic and ancient aliens who came down with the
Mm-hmm.
ships. So it's people have a completely different sense of what evidence is and what's not evidence. And I have a story here. This is fairly recent,
Mm-hmm.
maybe over the last couple of days. This was from Fox News. It says Harvard UFO study claiming aliens could be on Earth disguised as humans. This is a recent paper
Mm-hmm.
published by Harvard and Montana Technological University, which speculates that an unidentified technologically advanced population could possibly be living secretly among humans on Earth. And this is more of a thought experiment than an attempt to prove it so.
Well,
So
you have people like Whitley Strieber and others who Strieber, in one of his abduction experiences, was brought into like an ordinary house somewhere. Looked like it was in America. There were regular books on the bookshelf, and there were these weird-looking humans. In fact, one of them looked human, perfectly normal, but the other two didn't quite look normal. Right? This is what he claimed, and I ran into by accident an abductee, a UFO abductee, 34 years ago, and he told me about these blonde aliens that owned a cemetery in it was either Glendora or Pasadena, somewhere like that. And he said, "Well, if you don't believe me, go out there and find out for yourself." Well, of course, I went out there and I didn't see anything unusual.
okay.
Um, and it's like, and he sounded pretty crazy,
Hmm.
right? And so if you meet one of these people and they can be very insistent and very persuasive, but it's often very strange, and you think, well,
Well,
there's something a screw loose here with this person, but
yeah, I mean,
but then but
I'm
yeah,
internally curious. Obviously, I'm internally curious, but
right. Oh, of
it's
course.
when you talk about more earthly subjects regarding to secrets and intelligence and the Russians and other
Right.
empires.
In
I mean,
intelligence,
you
you
gotta
don't,
be,
right.
yeah. I mean, you gotta learn the way intelligence people think, right? When they try to disprove something, when they debate this stuff, and they weigh the options and they weigh the scenarios. Now, here in the story, it says these beings could be disguising themselves as humans to blend in and may have come from Earth's future or might have descended from intelligent
Oh, yeah.
dinosaurs, the researchers said. Well, let's just think about that for a minute. So, people in the very near future maybe start to claim that certain humans walking around are in fact aliens from the future or descending from dinosaurs. Now, how do you make the distinction? Because we've seen this from the well understood field of psychology or psychiatry. There are people on the schizo spectrum, schizoid, schizotypal,
Mhm.
schizophrenics, and they
Yeah.
believe all sorts of things, and they absolutely believe them. Okay, and they may feel
Yes, they do.
threatened. They may feel
And
threatened
they hear
by
voices. By
average
the way, they
people.
hear voices, right?
Yeah, they hear voices and they feel
Yeah.
threatened by average humans who they believe to be aliens coming to get them, evil forces, interdimensional beings out to get them. Now, we in Germany, we had some fairly recent cases of spree killers, right? Politically motivated spree killers. And in this day and age, these people record themselves, right? So they make videos and they put them on the web, and then they do something crazy, and they write manifestos, and then after the fact, when the tragedy happens, we can read a manifesto. So there was this one guy who I think he shot up a Turkish restaurant, right? There's a lot of Turkish restaurants in Germany. So he shot up a place, and then the media looked into this guy's videos and writings, and it was a blend of standard trutherism, standard conspiracy media, mixed with something that sounds pretty much like the movie The Matrix, which I believe was from 1999, and I think everybody has seen it at this point. These agents were after him, he thought, and they had these super abilities like in the movie where everybody is, a computer program representation.
Schizophrenia.
Right. So this is what
which
experts...
means he's dangerous, by the way, because 20% of the homicides in the U.S. are committed by paranoid schizophrenics.
Wow.
A lot of people don't know that.
Okay, I didn't know that either. Interesting.
Yeah.
This is how you learn something new every day, especially on this show. So it says here the academics at Harvard and MTU admitted that their research may be regarded with skepticism. Oh, really? By many, but urged the scientific community to consider their claim in a spirit of epistemic humility and openness. Well, fair enough. If you have a super advanced species deriving from dinosaurs or the future, they may choose a camouflage. They may be able to replicate things and try to understand us from within. Fair enough. That's a fair thought, okay? But where are they? And how can we tell who they are? It says here, okay, and this is not a joke. I'm quoting from the Fox News story about the study, and they include some commentary from other people. It says, third, there could be hidden occupants likened to earthbound angels or fairies on Earth, or that have traveled to Earth. What's a fairy? What's an angel? According to that, how do you even begin to start making start doing research?
There's a Renaissance story about a Renaissance writer, philosopher, thinker who supposedly entertained beings from another world, and it's just one of those blips in history, and people, what in the heck was this? An invented story? Was it something real? There is Ingo Swann, who was in he was considered at one time one of the best remote viewers in the U.S. intelligence program back in the 70s. He was drawn into some kind of remote viewing of supposed alien construction on the dark side of the moon, and he claimed that he then ran into this alien woman in a supermarket. He wasn't sure she was an alien, but these government agents from this program were present there and warned him off. Don't contact this woman. You have some very strange stories, obviously, that told by some very unusual people, by the way, and you don't know what to make of it. But I think getting back to Coldhart's speech before this group, which is it's an extremely interesting speech. Coldhart explained how he got into it, which I think is more intriguing, and Coldhart's process of research. He thought, and I think it's the correct thought, that the U.S. government since World War II has been working on some very advanced things, and that he looked at gravity propulsion research, and he found that in the 1950s, after World War II, there were the science magazines were full of this, and that they were funding it openly. And there were all these groups doing it, defense contractors doing research on anti-gravity propulsion. They even found that the ideal shape of a craft for that is a disc-shaped, sort of a saucer with a flat bottom, an inverted saucer with a flat bottom. And of course, this was intriguing. Then you get around 1960, 61, and Coulthard notes it all disappears. There's nothing published after that, as if it They made a breakthrough somehow in the 50s, and then it was all top secret. You know what I'm saying? And so how he did his research, which is interesting, is that he found 160 names of physicists and engineers who had been mentioned in those magazine articles, and he traced who would be in those and those different programs that existed that maybe continued to exist. And he went and he made this list of names of people who would have been continuing that research, who would still be alive. Got their addresses, there were 160 of them, and he wrote to each one of them. And he said it took a long while. And this is the interesting part to me. He got quite a few responses saying, don't write me, don't call me, never contact me again, right?
Please ghost me.
When he made this, right? And then he got one guy, calls him on the phone, this Nate Kovitz, who worked for the Navy, the 92-year-old, who, and this is really the you could say it's the closest thing to proof that Coulthard found. It really got his attention, what this Nate Kovitz told him. And then, of course, you have, in the meantime, Coulthard's using his government sources to find people, and there's something like 15 to 20, if I'm judging right from the way he's talking and naming people, or not naming people rather, that there's quite a few that claim what David Grush is claiming, but who won't go public, or have even appeared before Congress in camera, but won't go public. And of course, I don't think he's talked to anyone who directly claims to have seen the proof themselves, but only know of the program, right? And know of it. So this raises the question as to what this program is. Is it a bluff against Russia and China? Have we created this out of whole cloth to if we convince our own public that we're hiding secrets, Russia and China, it's like a deterrence. This is one theory, by the way. This is one theory that I entertain. The other theory is that they actually have recovered something. But it's interesting. I asked Mr. Wang, and this is something Ross Coulthard believes that China and Russia have recovered these things. Well, Mr. Wang, who has extensive sources in the PLA, I said, have they recovered anything? And he says, no, because I would have heard about it. Right?
Yeah, and it is on people's minds. It is on people's minds, really. I mean, if you're a scientist, if you don't work as a scientist, it's on people's minds to some degree. I mean, when you were around in the 2000s and you played video games or computer games, there was a huge best-selling game called what was it, Crisis, right? This came from, I think, a German studio and became a global hit. Super detailed graphics, and you play this super soldier special forces person from America, and you have this nano suit that can disguise you and has all other functions. And the whole plot is that in communist North Korea, alien artifacts are found and activity is found buried in the mountains. And so now the race is on because the Koreans want to get a hold of this stuff and use it, and they don't know what to make of it. And of course, the American Special Forces community wants to get there too. And so you have to fight your way through these commies, and you have to blast a lot of communists in order to get to the aliens ultimately in the game. And there's a new Steven Spielberg movie coming out. I have some notes on that. So one of the most recognizable names in filmmaking, Spielberg, who has done alien-themed movies in the past. I think he's done E.T., I think Close Encounters of the Third Kind. What else has he done? Anything else alien-related? I mean, he's known for that subject matter. And,
E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right?
Yeah, and so it's on people's minds. It's not like we have to be told to think about it, and we have to be told, that if there's something, we have to be practical about it. Obviously, we have to be practical about it. And if you've seen the movies and you play the video games, you have play acted a pragmatic approach to the subject.
Yeah, I mean, people have seen things, and this is what it's very interesting. They had in their testimony before Congress last summer, they had 3 witnesses. 2 were pilots that had seen these things up close in their aircraft. And this is very credible. You can't, it's just like President Trump said. He's talked to these pilots. What they're saying is very credible. You can't. I mean, they see them. These are honest, credible people. This doesn't help their career. Rather, it would likely hurt it. And then you have David Grush, who kind of investigated and was told about these programs, and that he wasn't allowed to say anything or know more, and about contractors being involved in research. And of course, this is this is almost like hearsay, but yet there's other people supporting the testimony. So I think, and Coulthard makes the point that we have in the United States, we have the Constitution, and we have congressional oversight, which has been established for around 200 years. There was an Army fiasco in the Pacific Northwest after we got those territories, where the Army ran afoul of Indians up there, and there was a congressional investigation. It was when Congress established its effective oversight over the military, over federal programs. And so that is established law. The Supreme Court recognizes it. And so to have things, of course, you have the question of secrecy, but so this is a sticky wicket. You know, what can be kept secret,
and from an intelligence perspective, I don't like generalized arguments of mass or arguments by mass. You know, it's when people say, well, there's been so much done about it, therefore it must be true, because, you know, this argument has failed so many times. And I drew that comparison on my website, Candor Intel. I drew that comparison before between some of these ultimately debunked things about UFOs and aliens, and I compared this to the fake protocols of Zion, right? Because so much has been written about it, and people think, well, it must be something to it, or it must be true because so many people have done something about it. No, something can be absolutely false, even though there's a large mass of material on it.
Well, it's a matter of evidence is tricky. Well, one of the things now that I misspoke a bit. Coulthard, we haven't seen, Coulthard hasn't brought forward by name any direct witnesses other than Nate Kovitz, because Nate Kovitz, told him on the record with his name that he went below Wright-Patterson and saw this fragment of a bulkhead from a crash thing, and said it was not manufactured on Earth. There was a process in which the molecular structure of it was obviously, it was a process of manufacturing we don't have. So that is the closest thing, and that's the evidence he has. But he revealed in his speech before this group something new, although he couldn't name a name. It was an Australian photographer that was loaned by Australian military to the U.S. military about a crash that supposedly happened in eastern Australia in the jungle mountain area, right? Where this thing had crashed. And this guy told Coulthard that he had photographed the outside and inside of the craft, and this is years ago, and he was made to develop the film right there at the site and hand it over, so he couldn't take anything with him, and that he was afraid to give his name out. And so these are the kind of stories. Of course, the problem is believing stories from anonymous people, because obviously they could say anything, and when your name's not attached to it, there's no responsibility.
And when you deal with a source, from a strict traditional intelligence perspective, right? So you have to you have to analyze.
You have to know who.
Where first of all, who is the source? How qualified is the source? What access does the source have to intelligence information, and also
and how reliable are they?
So you have to figure out
reliability.
You have to figure out, is this source trying to sell you information that is not relevant or not real, or that he's just got out of a newspaper or some hearsay. And the other thing is, I think, wishful thinking, which might come out of a positive motivation. So, for example, if you work at the CIA in the Cold War, and you have sources or you run sources, maybe the source is influenced by wishful thinking or the drive to defeat communism, and maybe the source
Mhm.
is presenting a bit of a piece of information, um, and the information is distorted because of that wishful thinking or because of that drive to win, right? So there's all kinds of
Mhm.
things at play here.
Well, the thing, Ross Coulthart himself says, he admits that since he got interested in this, these sources could have come to him to feed him the information. But so he's open to that possibility, but he doesn't really think so because of the variety of the sources from coming from different areas and what they're telling him. But you can be a journalist has to be realistic and realize he could be set up to believe something and be fed something, especially when something so important as the security of the Pacific region, the security of Japan, Philippines, Australia itself could be at stake when the Chinese maybe have an advantage and could
Yeah.
attack, and they're afraid to.
Yeah, and if you miss something important, even if it seemed very remote, if you miss something very important, that's a bad outcome. And you mentioned that, when the Chinese are getting nervous about the Americans because they don't know what the Americans have. So it's like
Yeah.
you have to be aware that sometimes there are remote things, and there may be many remote things that could be true and could be very, very relevant. So it's like it's the
Yeah.
same
And
as
and
when.
I told this story before that I was at the 2-day conference in April 2001 on the North Korea, and the top North Korea uh, negotiator translator was there at the conference, and I carpooled with him to the hotel with some other folks because we had the same hotel, and he had also been a negotiator translator for China. And I think I'd mentioned this before that the Chinese had asked for the UFO secrets that the U.S. has. And when he went and translated that to the American officials said, "You can't have that." Instead of saying, you know, um, we don't have, there's the, what is, it's ridiculous.
Hmm.
There's no aliens or anything. But the U.S. didn't give that answer to China. So we might be looking at a very long-term deception on the Chinese, or we really have something, and the
or
Chinese are
there
scared for a
is
reason.
or there is genuine ambiguity, because we mentioned this a few minutes
Ambiguity.
ago. How do you tell? How can you tell if an
How
organism
can you tell?
if
Yeah.
an organism if a piece of debris is what you think it is, or it's not what you think it is, and maybe there's actual ambiguity. People really don't know, and so the Chinese wouldn't
Yeah.
know, and they don't know if we know, and it becomes really, really interesting. And we know this from disaster preparedness, especially when governments do it. Usually people prepare for likely events that are not so disastrous, and people
Mm-hmm.
tend to not prepare for unlikely events that are disastrous when they occur, because you think,
Yeah.
it's not going to happen, right? But when it happens and you have zero preparation, you're screwed. Very bad outcome. And that's why obviously you have to consider the UFO issue, because you don't want to miss anything that's absolutely crucial. And
Well, and Coldheart mentioned this, and I knew this. This has been known for years that this UFO disclosure movement is really was really sparked by top intelligence officials back in the 1950s. It was the first director of Central Intelligence, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was basically running NICAP, the National, uh, what was it, the National Investigative Committee for Aerial Phenomena, which was very famous in the United States back in the 50s and 60s. And he was for pushing for public disclosure back then. So was Rear Admiral Delmar Farney. And there was a Donald Kehoe, a Marine Corps, I think he was a Marine Corps air wing guy. But these guys, they knew a lot of pilots. They knew people were seeing this stuff. Helen Coder had his own very weird investigation of UFOs when he was the CI director, um, in which Blue Book had in its original files when President Ford declassified him. I got the little book at the time out of curiosity and read them. And there was a seance held in the Pentagon to try to conjure a UFO. And Hillenkoetter apparently was, if I'm remembering correctly, he was involved in that. And it was, you could see why they would keep this secret. It's a little embarrassing, is it not?
Hmm.
And of course, a UFO supposedly manifested and was tracked on radar. These are things that you would that are maybe a bit scandalous,
Yeah, but do
in
we even
retrospect.
have the right tools to detect super advanced civilizations or entities? Because we
Well,
have to rely
yeah.
on our senses. We have to rely on the tools that we have, and maybe our
Well,
tools are
this
not
is the
good enough,
big
right?
dilemma. Yeah, the dilemma. Look, we have radio telescopes, and I've read about them. Sigma Draconis, which is a star system that could have habitable planets. I don't know the latest on it, whether they think they maybe even found planets there. It's 20 light years from the Earth, and our radio telescopes could pick up a radio conversation between two kids with toy walkie-talkies.
Wow. Yeah.
That's how good our radio telescopes are.
Yeah.
That is, so you think about how many star systems we've looked at with radio telescopes, how much this is, we've been doing this for, I think, close to 50 years, maybe longer, looking for radio signals, artificial, intelligently, generated radio signals. And we have not found any that prove this,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, there's
We
this. Yeah,
we we haven't, yeah.
there's this movie, very popular one called Interstellar by Chris Nolan, who also made the movie about the Oppenheimer fiasco, and we talked about that Oppenheimer movie in the case. And so in the
Mhm.
movie Interstellar, they introduce kind of this contact with entities from other dimensions. So it's not via
Yes.
radio signals, it's not something that we are used to, but there's a scene where one of the astronauts, a woman, she's almost touching, or she maybe even be touching, physically touching one of those entities while they go through a wormhole sphere thing to make that interstellar travel. And then she talks about the experience, and later you see these beings again. Now, of course, when we go back to that study that I just briefly mentioned, that Fox News and others have talked about, when we think of a super advanced entity, a super hyper intelligent entity or civilization, wouldn't they be able to understand our shortcomings and find quickly the right approach for us, right? Shouldn't they be able to determine, okay, this human species is on that level, let's just communicate with them in the right way so everything goes goes nicely, right? Wouldn't
Yeah.
they be able to do that?
Yeah. And of course, in the past, there's been people who have made claims, like Robert Sarbacker, who was a scientist who claimed, I think it was many years ago, to have knowledge of flying saucer recoveries and materials from non-human technology. And these are people that existed before, long before Ross Coulthard got involved in this subject. There have been people that have made claims for years. I mean, Frank Edwards, the journalist who wrote Flying Saucer Serious Business, of course, he got the title of his book from the head of the Air Materiel Command, General Nathan Twining's memo saying this, that, they're not, UFOs are real, they're serious business, this kind of thing, flying saucers. And so you do have some documents that are very odd, that the military, you've got an FBI document from Hoover about the FBI wanting to get a hold of discs recovered. It's a memo that got declassified through Freedom of Information years ago. So there's these little tidbits, but the thing is who are they authentic? Did they get generated by a program to deceive the public? And you think, well, there's so many of these little tidbits, it can't be. Well, you'd be surprised. Look at how
Yeah.
they attempted to fool the German generals with the fake army in front of Normandy going to
Sure.
Calais, right?
Yeah.
Instead of Normandy. So, these things can be quite elaborate by intelligence services. So you do have to have some skepticism.
Here's a fairly recent story. I think this is from the last couple of days. I think it's about Greg Egigian, I hope I'm pronouncing this halfway correct, professor of history and bioethics at Penn State. In his new book, which I haven't read yet, after the flying saucers came a global history of the UFO phenomenon. Egigian explores how individuals, scientists, governments, and the media responded to reports of UFO sightings and alien abductions, and what those responses say about the human experience. Quote, human beings have always tried to unpack mysterious phenomena. This scientist said, unpacking a phenomenon that still has no clear conclusion or any clear evidence means that we're projecting values and ideas onto it. The story of UFOs is a story of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Sounds kind of interesting. Maybe I'll read that next. It's yeah, I mean, at least he's saying, you know, he doesn't see a clear conclusion yet, and we may be colored in our thinking about it because that's who we are. You know, that's how we roll.
The phenomenon is very complex, and it's one of the things Jacques Vallée said, that many scientific disciplines need to be involved in investigating it, because what the witnesses are experiencing may belong to a different reality than our reality. And this is where the interdimensional theory that Vallée wrote his book Dimensions about comes in, because what's really disturbing about the phenomenon is there's a reality busting aspect to it. And there's been, you know, in this, you've got Professor Donald Hoffman's book, The Case Against Reality, which is rather sensational, and it's very good. It's very interesting. He makes the case that reality is a tertiary. The physical reality is tertiary. The primary reality is spiritual or mental. And this is, by the way, most religions have you go to Buddhism, you go to Christianity, you know, and reality is a creation of the ultimate mind in Christianity, of God, who is the ultimate mind, spiritual being. And in Buddhism, you know, physical reality is dharmas. It's just a chaos of atoms. It's an unreal reality. And you go to Schopenhauer's philosophy or Aristotle's metaphysics, and you find the same analysis done by logic and reason. And so, and Bishop Berkeley too, you know, who, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, is there really any noise? And that consciousness is primary is the main idea that comes from that. And of course, some of the cutting edge physics, and this is Donald Hoffman's book, when you read it, it's very strange. He goes through all the latest cutting edge physics paradoxes. And he says the only way you can resolve these paradoxes is that reality is a creation of mind, not our minds, a larger mind that we live within, and that this suggests there could be other realities. There is a place that's outside of it. And so if these, whatever a UFO is, that opens a possibility for paranormal phenomena, which things, inexplicable things that are on the edge of reality, right?
Many people already are detached from what we call reality in general, you know, observable reality, because we do have a certain toolbox, obviously, to measure things and to look at things and to reproduce experimental results, right? So a lot of people are not even in tune with the toolbox, right? We talked about this show on Rogan, or some of the other shows on or guests on the Joe Rogan program, where people just talk gibberish and they string terms together that sound scientific.
They do talk gibberish. They do.
And people in the comment section are wondering, is this person off his meds or is he on something? Is there a bit of schizophrenia going on? We don't know. And, you know, I'm not qualified to diagnose people, especially over the internet. But people are very not in tune with what we call reality. They're not in tune with the toolbox. And a lot of this goes back to disinformation campaigns, especially Russia. They have some of the best scientists working on deception, right? They have the shrinks, they have the psychological warfare guys, and they've experimented on human perception, how you can influence it with various tools available. So if people are not even familiar with the standard toolbox, how can we expect people to get into tune with the maybe a more complex toolbox? You know, maybe aliens are watching this show right now and laugh at us because they think we're just dogs. You know, we're just primitive dogs we're primitive dogs and we were stupid, and it's all very funny to them. But
Or intelligence agencies belonging to different countries trying to get an advantage can see in the mythology of the UFO, in the experiences that people are having, can see the a possibility of creating a new theology. Well, it wouldn't be theology because it's not about God, an alienology, right? A new
mm,
philosophy of the world they could craft to their advantage. They could control and then infiltrate the cults that propagate it and the masses who believe in it, right?
yeah,
That aliens are going to come down and rescue mankind, right? This would be another kind of all we have to do. This is like the disclosure movement, by the way. Some of these people are actually preaching, let's reach out to the aliens and have them come down and save us.
yeah,
And of course, this is really, you're talking about a new religion here.
yeah.
And you're
I
talking about a
recommend that.
religion. Yeah.
I would recommend that people uh, who haven't seen it, they watch an older episode of this show, Friends and Enemies, where we talk about Carl Gustav Jung and Jordan Peterson, and sort of this thing where people get frustrated with Christianity, they get bored by it, and they try to look at older stuff, Greek mythology and the Hellenistic tradition, and sort of trying to go back to the past, but then people offer something even cooler than that, right? They say it's all mixed up. The old stuff is mixed up with the new thing, the alien thing, and so this becomes the new cool, right? When people
Mm.
get hop on board, and
Well, what's really interesting is, again, going back to Eric Vergelin. Eric Vergelin warned against Gnostic speculations. And why did he warn about that? Because Gnostic speculations, he thought, were the basis of this disoriented revolutionary politics, whether it's the Nazi movement, which he regarded as a Gnostic movement, or communism, which he regarded as a Gnostic movement. All the forms of why are totalitarians Gnostics? People who like Gnostic speculations get very upset. There's
well, if
even
you're a
a
ruler, I
bunch
mean,
of
if you're powerful, I mean, your day-to-day
it's powerful,
life experience is so different
right?
from the average person. I mean, the access you have, the control you have, you give an order and people actually carry it out, and it filters
Right.
through the empire,
Well,
and this is a whole
yeah,
nother experience, right?
it's the claim to have special knowledge of what the ultimate true reality is, and to say that the already existing structures in society, capitalism, Christianity, uh, modern science, even, are all no good. That they are a trap that we have to escape from. So we have to overthrow our institutions in a revolution and create and start over, create from scratch. And this is what, people like Edmund Burke would be going, oh my gosh, you don't want to do that. That would be a bloody disaster. And I think Gnostic, what is wrong with Gnostic speculation, though, is the people that end up leading this revolution end up creating their own orthodoxy, which then they start shooting people who disagree with them, who say, wait a minute, you don't have the ultimate truth. Nobody has the ultimate truth. Up against the wall, you're dead because you're not with the program, right? So Gnostic speculation becomes totalitarian, uh, lies.
Yeah,
A system of lies that everyone has to now nod their head and agree, yeah, this is the truth.
yeah, and somebody like Carl Gustav Jung talked about archetype stories, and we everything we conceive is based on these old stories, and it's like magic. And others have adopted this notion. I mean, we talked about Jordan Peterson and how he speaks of the stories and how they will make us conservative again and whatnot. And I commented on this, that Jordan Peterson stuff sounds to me like warmed over Freemasonry, and now there's a new movie in production or pre-production. It will be a Steven Spielberg original. So he's a master storyteller, and he's probably studied all kinds of stories that have been told. He knows how they work. A Steven Spielberg original with the idea for its narrative coming entirely from him. And there's some other producers and scriptwriters involved that have worked with him in the past on Jurassic Park, War of the Worlds. Right, he's also done a War of the Worlds movie. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which Spielberg executive produced. So why is Spielberg making space movies and this fantasy angle? I mean, obviously, if you ask different people, you get different answers. The standard truthers, conspiracy activists, they will say, well, he's Jewish, so he's got to be a member of the conspiracy. But Spielberg also made Schindler's List, right? The Holocaust movie.
Yes.
And we know how Soviet intelligence was able to recruit people in the West, people with a Jewish background, atomic scientists like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, and people with a high IQ, right? But these people were recruited and very much deceived by Soviet intelligence, because they used that sales pitch: we fought the Nazis harder than everybody else. So the West was doing all this appeasement, and the West was toying with fascism, especially Britain, and blah, 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 and American capitalism and all that. But the Soviets, the communists, ultimately fought the hardest war and defeated fascism. So I'm not too familiar with the person Steven Spielberg and his political views. Now, we know how left Hollywood is, and how Hollywood has been introducing all kinds of themes into movies over the last decade, especially the whole trans issue and everything. So now a new Spielberg, they say it's going to be a UFO movie. Biggest names attached to it, the big studios attached to it. Why is he doing this?
Do you know what the content of the movie will be?
They're not saying. It's just his name attached to
It's a secret.
it, and a UFO movie, and we know what he's done so far.
Yeah.
I mean, he's done the nice aliens with E.T., like the cute aliens, but he's also done the brutal aliens in War of the Worlds. Yeah, but he's also done the mean aliens with the War of the Worlds movie. So,
yeah. Well, it's. But what I would, if people want to really review the evidence for this being real, I would highly recommend them listen to Ross Coulthart's keynote speech at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies Conference. You could find it at a site called unidentifiedphenomenon.com. They have a lot of interesting things there. They do pretty good. They have a lot of links to a lot of the sources, and people who have before Coulthart have made these claims before. You've got, but one of the problems you have in this field is that so far nobody has actually provided the smoking gun proof to the rest of us, and that is kind of scary. There's just to maybe we want to do this as a segue to what we want to talk about next, which is Richard Poe's book, but conspiracy theory, which we talk about a lot, and how conspiracy theory has been used to manipulate masses of people, is a part of UFO theory. And many of the UFO activists with the more political taint to them that say the US government is evil, they're holding back secrets, we need to get at them. A lot of this material, a lot of this kind of thing is obviously could be used by foreign intelligence services to get at our secrets and what our actual capabilities are, and that could be dangerous. And I notice the hippie-like left-wing 60s taint on some of these people, right? When they start to talk. And it's like, what about the United States actually defending itself? Isn't that legitimate? Isn't it legitimate to have secrets so your enemy doesn't get your technology and
And
destroy
where's
you
the
with
risk
your own?
assessment when you call for
Yeah,
full disclosure or something close to full disclosure? Imagine if we
yeah.
have almost full disclosure and we figure out it's not alien technology, but we gave away secrets and now we have a problem. Do these activists make a risk assessment? What if your plan of full disclosure backfires and goes wrong? Do you consider that? Have you looked into it? What are the safeguards to that? And I don't think that many activists actually have a risk assessment, a proper one.
No, they
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 just go
don't. And
into this direction.
it's the evil U.S. military industrial complex. Always, it's the evil of that. And so what you end up is with an ultimately an anti-American sort of message coming through this stuff. When you find out, when you read Howard Bloom's book out, it's out there, which is about the Roswell document evidence coming from a document slush pile, supposedly that the Bulgarian Secret Service planted the MJ12 documents in that slush pile,
The
very
Majestic 12
possibly.
stuff, the stuff
Majestic
about the
12, which of
aliens.
course,
Yeah, the
yeah,
government has a secret program to
having this,
to
there's a secret
communicate with the
government.
aliens, and they
Yeah,
have a deal with the aliens, and it's not a good
right.
deal for the citizens.
Right. It's a deal where we get screwed and we screw the whole world. And so the US government is in this evil alliance with these evil aliens and the so this just sounds like a cartoon that's created by anti-American propagandists.
And it's like,
And I would
why would
say
these
that's
super
yeah,
advanced aliens have why would the aliens have to make a deal with these primitive humans in the first place? Like it's like you and me making a
no.
deal with a dog.
It doesn't make any sense. And especially it doesn't make any sense. This is what Jacques Vallée has pointed out. It doesn't make any sense when you look at the whole evidence of the phenomenon. The phenomenon has paranormal, normal, spiritual, psychological, cultural effects and meanings. And so it's more related to religious studies and cultural history and anthropology than it is related to some exobiology. Here, there's real aliens. And it's very funny that David Grush, when he talks about the crash recovery, he talks about biologics, but he says that they don't call them aliens, they call them non-human.
Hmm.
What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah,
Don't
it
know what
says here.
that means.
It says here,
Yeah.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, lawmakers and other lawmakers introduced provisions to look into this clandestine program and establish a government-wide UAP records collection. The latter was ultimately signed into law by President Joe Biden last December as part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. So I thought they didn't want us to know, right?
Hmm.
What
Right.
is it?
And of course, it's, I think, and this is my point here, is that conspiracy theory is not helpful in helping us understand these issues. Rather, people just love those conspiracy theories. So when it attaches to UFOs or some political confrontation like the war in Ukraine or World War, who started the Great Depression or who started communism in World War II, and we're going to talk about Richard Poe's book accusing the British of being the conspiracy behind communism. Um, it's always blaming somebody. There's somebody who's the villain, and then we're the good guys. We're going to expose the truth, right? This is a
people
form
have
of
to
this is
people
almost
have to
a Gnostic
love
formula, right?
accuracy. I
We
think
have the
people,
truth,
yeah,
right?
people have to start liking or loving accuracy. Okay, it's not about, okay, I like this idea more than the other because it gives me warm feelings. You have to
Yeah,
start to like accuracy. How many things can you get right? How right can you get these things? And this is what, I have trained myself to do, and this is what ultimately professional intelligence uh, agencies do. They have
yeah.
to
You
go
want to
for accuracy.
be careful about what your conclusions are. There's a lot of things we can't come to conclusions about. There's things, of course, speculation is, I think it's a necessary thing. We have to speculate to help to be creative in getting it, but we can't take those speculations then as gospel once we've done the speculation. Oh, that's true. Our speculations are true. No, they're just speculations that are creative, sort of thinking out loud about what it could be. Yeah, there could be aliens. There could be, Mr. Nolan in his books, and I've gone through them more recently. He talks about the possibility of a breakaway civilization from something that was pre-Diluvian, right? Something that existed before. There could be, a breakaway, a Captain Nemo type breakaway
Mm.
where people somewhere in the past developed advanced technology that they kept to themselves and that they're behind this. There's all kinds of explanations that do not involve extraterrestrials, right? And of course, there's the interdimensional paranormal. There's the demonic phenomenon, daemonic phenomenon. If you want to use some ancient pagan terminology, there's all kinds of interpretations out there. They're all speculative because we don't know, and we don't know because the phenomenon is intentionally elusive, like ghosts, right? Has anybody ever brought a ghost into a museum? Oh, here's the museum. We've got a ghost in a glass case, right? You can't, because when you get to this kind of edge of reality stuff, and this is where you get to the edge of, nobody's captured a Bigfoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is a Bigfoot? What is, the Loch Ness monster? Nobody's got it yet. So the thing is, what are they? And people see strange things, ghosts and apparitions. What did Johnny Keel call them? Crypto biology, animals that kind of maybe don't exist but seem to, that people see. What is it that people are seeing? What is this function of schizophrenia or hallucination or creative visualization? Is there a thing where people go into trances and experience things that aren't real but seem very real, right? When they take drugs or something.
Yeah, and
We
some
don't know,
scientists have
but
been some. I mean, reportedly. I mean, I'm not a physicist or something, but there have been some scientists that experimented with psychedelic drugs, and they got some sort of an inspiration out of it, but then they had to use the standard toolbox and figure out something new. But this creativity goes a long way, obviously. So that's why we love fictional stories. We read novels, and even when you prefer nonfiction books, right? Sometimes when you read fiction, it can make you see something in a new way, or some idea can trigger
it
something in
can.
you.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And of course, this is where science makes advancements and society does. But the new way I want people to see, because I'm a strategic thinker I'm trained as a political scientist. So I want people to see that they have an enemy, and we call this show "Friends and Enemies," and that their enemy can be manipulating their perceptions. Perceptions management is very much a Soviet or Russian method to manipulate masses of people in foreign countries and manipulate foreign governments. And of course, this is what could be happening with this UFO thing. And what's really dangerous is when people jump to conclusions about conspiracies. And of course, this is the segue into Richard Poe's book, and maybe you want to explain. He's trying to say the British invented communism. They were behind the Bolshevik Revolution.
Hmm.
Blah blah blah. I read most of the book. You read the whole thing. Tell me what your take on this book is. It's rather a sensational claim, is it not?
Well,
That the communism was invented by the British, right?
well, obviously, when you pick a title for a book, it needs to capture people's attention. It has to be bold, and you can't be too detailed in the title, obviously. So this is called "How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews." And there's aristocrats on the cover. It's by Richard Poe, and it says here New York Times best-selling author. And I believe his best-selling book was about. I think it was about George Soros, and it got some significant attraction. I think it was featured on the Glenn Beck program 14 years ago or something like that. And I watched some Glenn Beck stuff. I remember a decent report from the Glenn Beck people about Alexander Dugin, the Russian propagandist. But I was not familiar with Poe at all, and I saw this on Twitter or X, right? So somebody plastered the cover image on there and said, "Oh, this is a cool book." So I thought, Well, this book could be 10 years old. It could be 20 years old. I found out it was absolutely recent. It came out, I think, a month ago. And I've done over the last years, especially since 2017, I expanded my historical horizon, especially in terms of intelligence. I looked further into the past. I didn't do that before 2017 because I thought, as historians say, I thought real intelligence services started in the 20th century, and they were more or less improvised. Okay, so this is the conventional view. I had that conventional view, but then in 2017, I wanted to make my own study on 200 years worth of conspiracy media. So now, when you look into the time after the French Revolution and whatnot, you have to get a foundation of what the French Empire was and the British Empire and how it changed, and the German sort of empire and the Russian Empire. So I had to cover all my bases. I had to really get to know these empires and these different groups inside of them. And so some of the things that I found, I think, are pretty serious, and I found other people that have written about it. For example, people who know this program here, Friends and Enemies, they will be familiar with my concern about Lord Louis Mountbatten. Very powerful family. It's the House of Hessen, and he may have been one of the most, if not possibly the most disastrous communist mole, able to protect other moles and install other moles. Right now, of course, this is reconstructing. Trying to reconstruct history. It's very complicated to do, and there's always multiple scenarios, obviously. So I'm taking this very seriously, right? And I've looked at older intelligence networks and whatnot, because I assumed, because I knew a lot about the 20th century and the modern intelligence services. So when I looked into the past, I saw a lot of things that, rang a bell, so to say. I thought, of course, well, if you have a mega empire like the French or the British or whatever, if you have a mega empire, you probably need severe intelligence capabilities. And when you talk about the past, you don't get convenient files and photographic records and film records and whatnot. So it's difficult to do, really difficult. So then I see this thing on Twitter, how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews, and some of the things he writes in the book are things that I have looked at, and there's and others have looked at. So I mentioned this on the show. This was a double episode that we've done. It's called Fake Experts Part 1 and 2, if people haven't seen that. And I mentioned, for example, a fairly recent study from Austria, Professor Oberhauser, and he figured out that modern conspiracy mythology that started for real after the French Revolution, that this was an intelligence campaign. This was a larger intelligence campaign. So, so some of the stuff in the Poe book is very, very familiar to me. And so the Poe book is very short, unfortunately. The individual chapters are very short. And there's a lot of stuff he hasn't found yet. He's not mentioning the Oberhauser story. I'm not even aware if there's an English version of it. There's other things that he's not even mentioning. I don't think he's ever mentioning Lord Louis Mountbatten, even though there's significant literature on him, even new literature. I think there's one of the most recognized historians from Britain, who's really connected, a serious guy. He put out a book recently about the Mountbattens, meaning Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife Edwina, who was a total communist, and they all had communist ties. It's really crazy. So it's not mentioned here. Why would he not put it in there? Is he not aware of it?
Yeah,
So,
he's not aware of a lot of things. Well, let's just discuss the basic thesis. I mean, here's one of his claims. I mean, he's claiming that the British invented communism. So he says, well, the British were against the French Empire and they were against the Russian Empire. And guess what? There was a French Revolution and a British and a Russian Revolution. So the British must have caused them, right? He doesn't actually prove that the British caused the French Revolution, though he insinuates, and he uses these connections that aren't proofs. And so this is a real problem because he talks about Babeuf and the left in the French Revolution, but the left in the French Revolution didn't start the revolution and they didn't finish it.
Yeah, the
They
French
have
left
popped in
became
the
and the French
they were
left became more
guillotines.
significant later. They became more significant after
Yeah.
the
Well,
revolution.
you had the mountain, and you had um, uh, what was the guy that was Steve? He was stabbed in the bath by um, that girl from Normandy. He was. I mean, it was just briefly that the French left wing of the far left, the communist left of the French Revolution, really had a say, and they really didn't last long. And they didn't really start the revolution. So to
Sure.
claim that the French Revolution was communist isn't exactly
Yeah, and
correct. It ended with Napoleon being in
yeah,
charge, and
and
he was not a communist.
the big political fight in France at the time was the question of should we try a full republic, should we try a half republic, or should we stick with the monarchy? Now, communism wasn't even really part of that discussion, that political fight, and then came, of course, the this thing with Napoleon when he said, "Well, I have to do the old, Roman Emperor Augustus thing, and I have to be a dictator and whatnot." But I mean, it's like I looked at the French Revolution myself, and obviously, you see some destabilizing influence from British intelligence or aristocratic intelligence at the time, using Enlightenment groups, using even some groups like the Bavarian Illuminati or even some left wing groups. But this is just what you would expect, a standard attempt at destabilizing France. And this went several ways. I mean, one thing was, especially with the conspiracy literature that came after the revolution, one angle was, let's just tell people they should have a king in France and everybody else is just satanic. And then the other angle was, no, it's bad, satanic, evil to have a king. We should have a total revolution. Now, obviously, you try to destabilize an opponent, but Britain running the revolution.
There wasn't the political thinking of the British leaders was not to destroy monarchy as a principle because their own country was a monarchy. And although there were people like Mr. Fox in British politics who thought that a liberalization of France would be a good thing and could be positive and could make France and Britain ultimately friends, the idea that they would have been the really dangerous element in the French Revolution was, now I remember his name, Jean-Paul Marat, who was stabbed by Marie Charlotte Corday in the bath, who led the Mountain, which is the ferocious French left in the French National Assembly. These groups were in no way ever controlled by the British, and they were violently anti-British, by the way. And you have not only William Pitt the Younger, and you have of course the famous Edmund Burke, who wrote against supporting the revolution in France, said that it was going to become a disaster. They were going to guillotine people, they were going to kill the king and the queen, and they did, and they were going to end up with a military dictator, which they did. This is all in Reflections on the Revolution in France. The idea that the British, who opposed the French Revolution, who helped form the coalitions in opposition to the French Revolution, were the authors of it. I mean,
Yeah,
it's really
and
absolutely absurd that he suggests
and
this.
there was enough chaos in France already, because this political fight and the political discussion, half republic, monarchy, whatever,
Yeah.
this discussion was already complicated enough and more than enough to further the chaos, because
Well,
it
what
was
caused the French
relevant to
Revolution?
it
Yeah,
was so relevant to the average person, because they didn't know what
it's
the future was going to be like. Am I
yeah.
going
I
to
mean,
be subjected to this capitalism thingy-majingy, or is it going? Do I have that many rights or less rights? What is this going to be? And the left would say,
yeah.
well, we're going to make private property completely illegal forever, which seemed completely outlandish at the time.
I mean, and the British would never support that, and they wouldn't even support it as a joke or as a plot to try to destabilize France, because they knew that this was dangerous. They wouldn't want even these ideas to be spread around. But the French Revolution was caused by the fact that Louis the XIV and the XV and the XVI could not control spending, government
Yeah,
spending. Does this sound familiar? He
yeah.
couldn't control it. They got this huge debt. The king could not manage his payments, his
The
debt
time, I
payments.
think that
So what he did is he summoned the Estates General, which was because they could only raise taxes if the estates agreed. So he called Parliament into basically a French Parliament into session, and that French Parliament was empowered to raise the money, but instead they turned on the king and they ended up creating
the
overthrowing the king.
yeah, I think
It
the
was a
time
case of
just
a runaway democracy. It was the
the
same thing, by the way, happened in England
yeah, yeah.
with Charles the First. Charles the First had money trouble. He summoned Parliament, and of course, it became the Long Parliament. And the Parliament was summoned to take care of financial problems. The Parliament ended up seizing power from the King. So this was a thing that had happened in England. It happened in France. It's like an organic process of
and
the
the
development of these systems
and the time
of mixed
just
government.
the time and the place weren't right to even attempt to try a mega operation, left wing revolution in France, because as you just explained, Britain was not that stable either. They were not as
No.
successful as they were 100 years later, 200 years later, with all the modern science stuff. So this was not something that Britain really wanted to touch, because it
And
could
radical
spread
sewer
and
rats,
it could
yeah,
spread to Britain.
it could
And
spread.
we saw this in the in the controlled conspiracy literature that appeared right after the French Revolution, because these conspiracy authors, John Robison and Baruel and the others, they were very careful to say in these conspiracy books, well, Britain is cool. British Freemasonry is cool. They do not want any upheavals, and Britain is supposed to be stable, but these French are crazy and the Germans are crazy.
Britain is really the ultimate conservative power in this period, and of course, when you have sewer rats like Jean-Paul Marat, and you have the equivalent running around in England, people that never became famous because they never amounted to anything, because they were never allowed their bloody path to power. But these people are very dangerous. They're they're fanatics. They're willing to kill people. They have really crazy ideas. You've got the Marquis de Sade coming out of this period, claiming a
Oh yeah.
republic of great
He was
sexual.
followed by the
We could
police.
do
He
any.
was he was always followed by the police, right? They always
These
watched
people,
him.
yeah, the police had to, the police and the authorities and the intelligence services had to keep track of these people because they were crazy and dangerous.
Yeah.
And you definitely didn't want them anywhere near political power, because you had no idea what kind of calamity would follow those kind of people getting
Yeah.
power.
And so you have to
And of
be
course,
really, really careful. You have to be really careful when
yeah,
when you say terms like the Brits did this, or the
right.
French, or the German, or the Jews. Now, obviously, in one of the chapters in the book, he talks about the disastrous conspiracy mythologies, how people pin everything on Jewish people, and then they talk about the Jews as if they're all connected, and then they have the central headquarters. But you also have to be careful when you talk about the Brits, because Britain, the British Empire was very complicated and it was always changing. And when we talk about the era of the French Revolution, this was like a few generations into the new phase of the British Empire, with King George the First, the Second, and the Third, right? And so what I was missing in that Poe book was I was missing these fundamental terms when you talk about the very important European aristocracies at the time. Now we know the French aristocracy was very old and very powerful. They wanted to be the new Rome, and the French, they hated the British, and the British hated the French. Now, when we talk about the Brits, we have to ask, what Brits specifically are you talking about? Because some of these families, like the King George, the Georges, when we talk about them, you're talking about families that are from Hanover, which is in Germany. We talk about a cluster of families, and some of these other families attached to them, the House of Hessen, Schleswig-Holstein. I couldn't find these names in there, and this is really important when you talk about these things, because a lot of British in very powerful families, they were pretty German, but Germany at the time was not a coherent empire at all, right?
No, it
Uh,
wasn't. And in the 7 Years' War, Britain was allied to these parts of Germany that were invaded by France and attacked by Russia from the other side and by Austria below them. And so they had this is part of these long wars between the French interest and the British interest in Europe on the continent. And the British had this long-standing policy not to allow France to become dominant on the continent.
yeah, and we don't have.
And
So
this was
we
their
talk about
policy.
when you talk about the House of Hessen, right? The House of Hessen was even active in Tsarist Russia. They tried to get a foot in the door, and other European countries tried
Hmm.
to send their daughters, their princesses, to Russia, to get on the throne. And so this is something that's really complicated to understand. And now, of course, when then we talk about secret stuff, secret operations by these different groups, it's very, very, very hard to reconstruct because we don't have
Hmm.
convenient files. We can't just have boxes of papers that we can just look through and
Right.
study. It has to be very, very meticulous. Otherwise, you can get sort of the wrong idea because
And
when you
and
look at that book and that title, How the British Invented Communism,
right.
it can give people a wrong idea because the people out there, they understand very little about the British Empire and its
Yeah.
relationship with other empires, and of course the relationship with the revolution in Russia. So
It's a
it's
long,
easy to,
complicated story.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's not something I mentioned. I think at the beginning of the show, Russia. Russia in general, well, okay, the Russians, Russia in general, they just don't want to take responsibility for their own actions. They don't want to take responsibility for communism in Russia, and we hear that from Vladimir Putin. We heard it in the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin. They always claim communism
It's
was
somebody else's fault,
yeah, somebody
right?
else did that to
Yeah.
us, and we shook
Somebody else did
free,
that to us. Yeah.
and we freed ourselves, and now other countries were still occupied by the Jews or communism. These other countries, they need our Russian help to be free. Now, people can draw the worst possible conclusions from this if they don't understand what Brits they're talking about, what
Yeah.
Russians specifically
So
they are
you
talking
think
about.
Poe is maybe feeding into the current Russian propaganda of
I
making
know
Russia the innocent victim of the West?
I know nothing about Poe. I've heard on Twitter, and I haven't confirmed that yet. I heard on Twitter that he's, done an interview with a guy who seems to be very pro-Russia. So there's all
Hmm.
kinds of different people, and they have
Well,
different
I can see why
educational
pro-Russian
backgrounds.
people would definitely like this book because it's blaming the West for, and so just to go from his claim that Britain, the Brits were behind the communist French Revolution, he wants to explain how the Brits are behind the Russian Revolution. Well, then he goes into the Great Game and how Britain and the Russian Empire were competing in Asia, particularly, the Great Game and involving Afghanistan and these other locations, and how the Russians, of course, they wanted Constantinople and the Dardanelles, and that the British absolutely were opposed. He talks about Queen Victoria wanting to abdicate if the Dardanelles ever fell to the Russians. And then he goes into this elaborate thing about how the British didn't really want the Russians to be on the winning side in World War One, so they had to orchestrate a revolution. I mean, this is really quite ridiculous because, and then they claim that Trotsky was a British agent, which has been a claim by anti-Semites for a long time that Trotsky was a British agent. And Trotsky was Jewish, of course. He was the one prominent Jewish leader between,
Yeah, but
Lenin was not Jewish.
he was also a Russian. This is what people fail to understand. Just like with
Russian,
Lenin. With
yes, and
Lenin, these were Russians.
yeah, and of course Poe makes a big deal about the fact that Trotsky was sort of held in, I think, in a port in Scotland and not released to Russia. The British didn't let him go there right away. And that everybody, and then supposedly there's a conspiracy because the American government let him go. Well, I think anybody with a visa and a passport, America's going to let him go. We don't have a Berlin Wall to
And
keep people
everybody
from
had
leaving here.
connections with anybody at the time, which is something that
Yeah,
intelligence
yeah,
agencies or networks just do. They want
yeah,
to be able to have channels. They want to be able to
yeah.
talk to
And
people, and
and
some
and there,
decisions are made. But
yeah.
when you talk about
Yeah, there wasn't a communist world power to be wary of at this time, and the fact that they let him continue on, I mean, maybe the rumor, which is not proven, is true, that Trotsky was blackmailed by the British Secret Service in London and turned into an agent. But we discussed Edward Ellis Smith's book on the young Stalin, how
Yeah,
Stalin, there's these credible stories that Stalin was an agent of the Okhrana. Well, that didn't stop him from being part of the revolution. It
sure.
didn't stop
And
him at all.
when
And of course, if yeah,
yeah, I mean, foreign countries, of course, they looked at what was going on in Russia. Of course, countries have ideas what should happen or not happen with other countries. So everybody was talking to everybody. Everybody was looking at everybody. And when you talk about a place like Russia, I mean, it's not surprising that Russia was the place of the communist revolution, because Russia was so terrible in so many regards. They did not have an enlightenment. They did not have a republic. They did not have a semi-republic. They did not have scientific breakthroughs like in the West and
the system was
capitalism.
brittle.
It was
Russia was
terrible.
brittle.
It was so terrible. I mean, I
Yeah.
heard that when I heard that thing in the Vladimir Putin interview, the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson, when he talked about the 1,000-year glorious, or more than 1,000-year glorious history of the Russian Empire. And then he mentioned the celebration. It was I think it was a 1,000-year celebration he mentioned in 1862. That was roughly 1 year after formally ending serfdom, which was already done and over in other more developed countries. This was
Yeah.
ridiculous to have serfdom that late in the game. And even when they stopped serfdom in Russia, they couldn't even make things work anyway. So it was so terrible. And of course, communism really needed downtrodden peasants who didn't know anything, and that's why the communist revolution
you
could
had
work
the
in
Russian
Russia.
intelligentsia was infected with anarchism and socialism, and you even had Dostoevsky's book *The Devils or the Possessed*, in which he writes about this in the 19th century, about how these young intellectual youth were just, crazy, violent, dangerous revolutionaries. And you have this problem in Russia that is not to do with anything that the British do. And of course, do the British want, in the middle of World War I, and this is, I mean, there's a chapter here, I think I read it to you before we did the show. There's a chapter in Poe's book that's absolutely ridiculous and shows an incredible ignorance of just the basics of history. And he has a chapter that's the beginning of, I think, chapter 23, where what he says is, he says basically, let me find it here. I want to read it exactly. Why the
Yeah,
Germans helped Lenin. And this is just bizarre. Chapter 23 says, from a practical standpoint, it was never in Germany's interest to overthrow the Russian government. I mean, that is
really,
stupid.
really.
Because Germany's fighting a two-fronted war in World War One. The Russian front has half of their
They
armies.
needed
The
a
Western
break.
front has the other half. They needed to collapse the Russian front, and they had this wild scheme that somebody in the foreign ministry thought up, that if we provoked a revolution in Russia, we could get the Russia out of the war, and we could then put all our
Yeah.
armies against the
And
British
also,
and French on the Western
if
front.
if these terms are tossed around, well, in the book, like the Germans, did this or wanted that or the other.
Right.
Germany was probably the most ludicrously complicated place you could imagine, because there's families like the Prussian Hohenzollern family. They were very powerful in Germany at the time, but they had to share power with these other families, and these other families like the House of Hessen or the Hanover guys. Other families in Germany that were tied to Britain. So, and even the House of Hohenzollern, they had some serious family relations to the British highest level aristocracy. So it's something
they obviously
that
weren't
is
getting along
very,
in
very complicated.
1917. What I would say is that the German government, the foreign ministry, the banking system, the army, and the Kaiser, as the commander-in-chief of their military, all agreed to send Lenin in a sealed train back to Russia after the February Revolution, in which the Tsar abdicated. And they were going to try to promote him in a revolution to break up, because the new revolutionary interim government, the Kerensky government, was pro-Allied, and they were Russia's going to be a democracy. We're going to fight on the side of the French and the British, and the Americans were just entering the war in April of 1917. So the Germans thought of this idea to get themselves out of the two-front war, and they supplied Lenin with a lot of money through the Bank of Siberia. They also moved money through Copenhagen, through Denmark, a neutral country, and it succeeded. The Bolshevik Revolution succeeded in early November of 1917, old calendar October, and this was. But the thing is the Germans were behind the Bolshevik Revolution, and Lenin could arguably be called a German agent, just as Stalin could be called an Ukraine agent, or maybe Trotsky could be called a British agent. But it didn't matter. The revolution made it not matter. And afterwards, I just want to say this one point: the Kaiser said, there's a document in the Kaiser's hand saying, now that Lenin has succeeded, he is completely in our hands. We can expose him as our agent, right? So he is not free to do what Lenin's the creature of our own invention. Of course, Kaiser had to abdicate, and that he wasn't able to hold anything over Lenin, but that is the truth. So the idea that Britain was behind and then he doesn't mention the Lockhart plot, where the British tried to overthrow Lenin in the Bolsheviks.
Riley operation.
So if they were behind the Bolshevik Revolution, if the British are, why are they trying to overthrow it by having their agent Sidney Riley bribe the Latvian Rifles to kill all the Bolsheviks in their Congress?
Yeah. So obviously,
right?
I mean, people, if people don't know this, when the peace happened, when the Germans, when the Germans, well, when the German government sort of got what it wanted. It got that change in Russia, and Russia was occupied with itself. There was the end of the hostilities between Russia and Germany. Then there was a phase of uncertainty in Russia. How is this going to play out? Will the Reds win, or will the Whites win? And this is, of course, when you saw all these debates in Britain and other places. And there's a chapter in the Poe book, obviously, but there's a mountain of historical records already how Britain debated this. How should we get involved in Russia in a big way? Should we, as Churchill said or suggested, should we strangle Bolshevism in the crib? Should we get rid of it now so it doesn't become a problem later? But the other arguments but the other arguments at the time prevailed in that situation, and these other people said, well, we just were involved in World War I. We've been bleeding so much, we're running out of money. Why should
they
we
were tired,
send?
And the populace wouldn't accept it.
Why should we send all these troops to Russia to fight on behalf of the Whites, who were also pretty creepy? These Whites were not, the fairy tale good guys, and not really stable guys either. So there was this debate, and the result of the debate in Britain was, we will not get involved in a military sense in a big way. They tried the intelligence way of solving things with the Riley mission and others. But we have a mountain of historical record. We know Britain made these choices, and America also thought along those lines. Why should we be involved in a big way? And so ultimately, and this is key to understand, the decision was made in Britain to let Russia, very key, to let Russia figure out its own fate. They have to work things out. And this is something Russia, even today, with Putin giving this interview with Tucker Carlson, they will never admit that this was a situation. The Russians did this to themselves. They made these choices, and the peasants made these choices to join the Red Army and kill other Russians. You can't blame it on the Germans, even though the Germans made some terrible choices, obviously. But you can't just all out blame it on the Germans or the Jews, right? And then build a whole nother ideological, a
conspiracy theory
on that base. On that base.
The Kaiser's support for Lenin was a conspiracy, but just as the Lockhart plot was to overthrow them. But the problem is just because you start something for the purpose, and they thought that they were going to be able to do this. They didn't intend a communist regime to permanently exist in Russia. That wasn't their intention. They just were trying to get out of it very at a military of a two-front war. And the same always said when countries make really bad decisions, strategic decisions, to get out of a short-term problem to create a long-term problem that's
Yeah.
much worse. This we see over and over again in history, and of course it's so the problem with Poe's book is that there's all kinds of things that he leaves out because they would cause the debunking of his theory. There are all kinds of cheap conclusions he draws on evidence he doesn't really have. He just sort of proposes it. He just speculates without having adequate proof. And then he sort of makes it look like he has something by making these plausible arguments about the British being enemies with the Russian, with the Tsars and with the kings of France, that they would do a revolution in those countries. And so it's just a bad
Yeah, and
history.
also
I want my $9 back
when you
for
look at,
buying this on Kindle.
well, I mean, it's there's a whole nother layer to this whole story, and I was missing that layer in the book, and that is when you talk about communist intelligence, Bolshevik intelligence, or later than Soviet intelligence, the events of the time, right? Especially concerning Britain, there was a huge problem of intelligence infiltration in Britain. This is when when these problems started to happen that became so pronounced during the Cold War. With the Cambridge Five and Lord Mountbatten and the atomic spies, when Britain was starting to fail spectacularly on foreign intelligence, when they had a stellar reputation before in foreign intelligence against the Germans, right? And there's some things I have looked into, and this is sort of when Britain was figuring out what to do. Britain was figuring out what to do with Russia and how to deal with these communists. And communist intelligence, they were able to score some pretty significant victories. And once you recruit somebody from the aristocracy, even a single mole can cause catastrophic results. So then if you look at British government decisions, right, especially the Crown, it's not so much a blunt British, conspiracy to create, the Soviet Union. You have to look into the baseline mole hunting traitor question. Who got himself in hot water, and who started to work for the Soviets, who started to give intelligence to the Bolsheviks, right? Because when you look at the later decades, not too far into the future, if you look at Lord Louis Mountbatten and even the current books that have been written about Louis and his wife Edwina and all their communist contacts, so it's just like you must never forget the core task of mole hunting. And in Britain, there's so much literature on all these moles in Britain, and people have been finding new suspects and have established more facts about British suspects. Like Louis, like Hollis, at the MI5, some weird people at the MI6, and so this is something that I was missing from the book. Now it's interesting if you get into older intelligence networks, if you look into communist moles in British aristocracy. It's interesting when people get into that. But it's like you got to be careful when you say Britain did this or the other, because what is Britain if you have moles? What was Germany if you have moles? If you have communist moles running around everywhere. Who is then making the decisions, or who is influencing the decisions? How can you say there's a centralized decision-making process, and so they did all this stuff, when you have this mole question, and there's so many versions of this and permutations.
Have agents of influence, has a Harry Dexter White or a Harry Hopkins influenced your policy or your strategy during World War II, so that the United States is not just simply acting in its own interests, but through agents of influence acting in the interest of Moscow? And then we have that problem today with the Chinese influence in the US government and the British government in Europe and the Russian influence agents and so on. there's a real problem here when you have open countries that can be infiltrated. I just in the last week I published the Sidewinder report about the infiltration of Canada, and of course they had the scandal coming out that a number of Canadian politicians were being accused of being agents of a foreign power. You have that warning in the Sidewinder report, which is a joint Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canadian Intelligence Service report saying our politicians are in danger of being captured by Chinese financial interests.
Yeah.
You have the same kind of problem in the United States and other countries. So it's we have to, and then there's the whole refugee crisis and the ideological influence. Whose interest is it to open the U.S. border to allow 1 million Muslims into Germany in 2014? Whose interest is it to
Yeah.
do this?
And it's like when
And
when you're dealing
not
with
in Germany's interest, not in
when,
America's interest.
when you're dealing with the intelligence world, intelligence professionals, they have to play this super chess game where you have many permutations. So for example, somebody, high-ranking politician, this could be a prime minister of Britain, this could be a head of intelligence, this could be a Lord Mountbatten, somebody becomes suspect. Communist contacts, business dealings with the Russians. The wife is involved with communism and all that. Somebody becomes a suspect. So now you have to do this chess game. You have to think 10 plays, 20, 30 plays ahead. If this person is a communist mole, a Soviet mole, then the results of that is this, and the other. If another person is a mole and not that one, then you have a whole different set of versions and permutations. So this is kind of the complexity of that game, and this changes kind of the outlook on who's influencing or making decisions. And so it's very important that people have this solid foundation of intelligence thinking, because otherwise you're going to say, well, Britain or the British did this and that, and they created communism and made the USSR. It's very, very
We have that
intricate.
problem with our CIA. The CIA did this and that, and it's like, well, who at the CIA?
Oh, yeah.
And are there? And you have double agents. You have this real problem. If Aldrich James did something at the CIA, was the CIA doing it, or was the KGB doing it? Because Aldrich James was working for the KGB. So yeah, you have this basic problem, and I think that we have a lot of bad books and a bad analysis going on, journalistic type approach to events, where you take events out of their context, and then you
It
can
seems
actually
unfinished to
create
me.
your
I
own
think
context, a fake narrative
for
to
me
rearrange it all.
for me it seems like an unfinished book. It seems like an embryonic stage of different concepts, because he's getting into some relevant stuff that people should be aware of. He's getting into the conspiracy media and how it was created and how it was used, and how Jewish people have been blamed for everything, not just individual operations, but also the toolbox. It's like some people, the truthers, they believe that Jews did these intelligence miracles and they invented all these crazy evil techniques and tricks. But then if you look at conspiracy literature, they basically say that, well, the Rothschilds had a courier system and they gave out loans. And I'm like, this is nothing special. I mean, everybody had a toolbox back in those days. How can you claim Jews must run the world because they had a courier system and they had a bank? And so this is something that people have to get into in a very profound, deep fashion, right? It's unfinished. It's unfinished to me. It's very embryonic because, and also I'm missing the Russian angle here, because it's not just Britain, Britain doing some very questionable or even very nefarious things with conspiracy propaganda. I mean, this is something that was immediately taken over by the Russians under Lenin. I mean, Lenin had the protocols of Zion spread in the Muslim world, and they nurtured this stuff to a large degree, and they're still doing this today. So if you read that book and you don't have the background, what are your conclusions? What is the reader going to think? What is the plan going to be?
Badly misled. Yeah, you're
What is
going to
the
be
plan?
badly misled by reading this book.
Yeah, because what is the plan going to be if you read that book and you don't have that background? Will you place your hopes in the Russian state now? Because now Russia claims they have shaken off communism, which was forced onto them from the outside, and it was never Russia's fault that Russia became communist. And so does the reader then believe, you have to be against the West, you have to look for help from the Russians to liberate us from this grand conspiracy here. You can draw some horrendous conclusions from that. I don't see the author making those conclusions. It's not in there. But of course, you should be warning the reader about coming to wrong conclusions, because if you use historical arguments, and people do this all the time, all kinds of ideological people, they use historical arguments. They say, well, in history this happened, and that's why we have to do this and that now. But if you're wrong about your historical argument, you make the wrong plan and you make horrendous mistakes and you suffer from them. So this is something that I was missing as well. So I sent the author the link to our show. I sent him some other material and reading recommendations, like the Austrian study on conspiracy literature that's fairly recent, and some other stuff that's not in the book, like the whole Mountbatten angle. And so we'll just see if there's a response at all, if there's a positive response, a negative response. I don't know. But this is why people should read all kinds of books. Now, the best thing you could read is selected quality books, people who have worked in the intelligence field their whole lives, or people who have focused on something their whole lives. Of course, those are the best books to read, but the more you read, the more you can get out of books. So if you read a book that you don't like, or maybe even a book you hate, you can get ideas from it, right? So you see something, you see a thought, and you don't necessarily like what the author is doing with that thought, or it's not enough or whatever. You can still get ideas from it, right? You can still make use of it, and it's time. It's time that you can spend, especially if you think about what you just read. It's time well spent if you know what you're doing. It's better than watching movies and Russian propaganda, or watch Joe Rogan with guests talking about alien pyramids and that sort of stuff, because there's always an underlying, there's usually an underlying agenda, whether these people realize it or not, because opinions are so controlled these days. Ideologies are controlled these days, and it's hard to find anybody who has original ideas. Anybody who has original thoughts, an original opinion on something, that's rare to find nowadays. Usually you can tell within a few minutes roughly what category somebody belongs to, unfortunately, right? So it's like, okay, I can sort of see, he's coming from this direction, and he's partially tied to that group, and he's doing this and he's doing that. And we need originality. We need people coming up with something of their own. And of course, you need to have that solid foundation of all the good stuff, the cool stuff that's been done so far. You have to know the box before you can go outside the box.
Yeah, you do. So I think we've beaten up on Richard Poe enough for now. Maybe he will amend his book and understand what we're saying. It's always good to talk about communism. The other thing he talks about communism at the beginning of the book, by the way. He talks about communism didn't really die in 1991, and then he puts it on the British as if, well, we have to kill it in Britain. But the reality is it didn't die in Russia. It didn't die in Moscow or Beijing. The communist bloc is still operating. My challenge to everyone is look at who Russia is coordinating with. They're coordinating with Cuba right now with their navy. Cuba is a communist country. Venezuela, it's a communist country. They're helping Congo. They're helping Angola. They're helping South Africa. They're working with China. China's supporting them in the war. North Korea is supporting them in the war. All communist regimes. Tell me, how can it be that Moscow is not a communist country?
Yeah,
because also, it's in the communist bloc. Yeah, really in.
I thought it was important when the author Poe, when he made that comparison between real life communism and old school serfdom, because I mean I say that to about the modern left. I mean I make that very important point, especially with Putin's Russia today, because now they kind of have adopted this old style marketing, right? It's still KGB runs everything in Russia, and so they could make that switch in marketing from traditional communism to sort of a have a peasant serfdom facade. When Putin says that I own Ukrainians, those are my subjects, and I can recruit them for illegal wars, I can torture them, I can do whatever I want with them. That's my right, because I'm standing on the top of a 1,000-year plus empire. Now, this is some sort of marketing that some people in the West like to hear. Because of all the communism
Evidently.
here, because of all the socialism here, people are so fed up with this nonsense. They long for a salvation, and here comes Russia today and says, we're exactly what you want. And this is sort of the KGB's main trick in approaching people and recruiting people. They figure out what you want most, the thing that is missing in your life, and they pretend to give it to you, or they give you a little bit of that, but then they introduce all these other problems for you. So I think that this is an interesting thought that the author can expand on. That if you want to erode if you want to just destroy the foundation of communism, you have to uncover the lie that was communism from the beginning. Before communism,
and the
in
lies
Russia,
and you have to uncover the lies they're continuing to tell.
Yeah, because if you were a peasant, if you were a peasant under the czars, you had pretty much zero rights. You didn't own any significant property.
Well, actually, peasants had certain rights.
Yeah, sure. So, but if ultimately, if you worked on a field owned by some aristocrat, and then came the communists, you were still working the same fields. You didn't own anything, and things got even worse under communism. But ultimately, you couldn't change your position, and this is kind of the internationally recognized definition of serfdom or modern slavery. If you are forced to work under certain conditions and you have no way of changing this, and if you want change, you get punished for calling for change. This is an internationally recognized definition of horrible treatment of people. So the communism was a scam. It was never about having a plan for a glorious society. It was just a movement designed to speak to angry people so they would sign a Red Army contract, right? And this is why communism in essence is so primitive, because they needed it to be primitive. They needed to sell this to the peasants, and they didn't want any specific discussions of what exactly should this society be like? How would you determine the prices of goods and labor? What are your rights specifically, and how would you make sure?
And the Bolsheviks promised initially the peasants land, and they gave them their land, and then in 1929 to 1932, they took the land away from them.
Yeah. You have no significant control over the land. They say it's owned by everyone, the collective, but you have zero control over it. And it's like when you have the simplistic propaganda, you don't want actual discussion. You don't want an intellectual discussion, because that would uncover all these flaws and problems and the lack of substance. And this is why simplification can be a disastrous problem. When you say, well, the British invented communism, or the Jews are behind the big conspiracy. It's always meant to talk. It's always meant to speak to people who are not very educated, who are very angry and very tired. And so they don't want complexity. But if you want to deal with secrecy,
they don't want complexity.
If you want to deal with secrecy, secret operations, it is astoundingly complicated.
It is. And with that, we have to end. We've reached the end of our time, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the U.S. This has been Alex Benesch in Germany. This has been Friends and Enemies, and we've covered UFOs and Richard Poe's book. So hope you will join us next week for another episode. Thank you.
If you speak to any aliens, just let us know.
Yeah, we'd like to know about that. Thank you. We'd like to know the truth. They're out there, right?
I want to believe. Okay.